Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Moin moin to everybody joining us here live on site in Hamburg for the Maritime Forecast Launch to 2050. A warm welcome also to everybody joining us on the live stream. Thousands have registered to follow this event today. It's a pleasure to have you all with us here. You will be tired by the end of the week hearing how pleased people are to meet again in person. Nonetheless, it's so very, very true. So it makes such a difference. Thank you for joining us here today. It's a first in many respects. It's the first time we're launching the Maritime Forecast to 2050 live at SMHAM. It's the first time we're doing it in Hamburg, my hometown. And this very week also the world's global home for shipping, with everybody gathering at SMM. It's also the first time we're doing it in a hybrid setting. So a few lessons learned from the pandemic time. So fantastic to have you here and on the line. All in all, very, very exciting for me to be here. I am the Communications Director of DNV Maritime, and it's a pleasure to be your host for this coming hour. We are here, as you all know, to officially launch the 6th edition of the Maritime Forecast to 2050. It's DNV's Maritime's flagship report that we publish on an annual basis. It is part of the Energy Transition Outlook series of reports that we publish in DNV. In the report, we regularly assess how shipping can play its part and how we can ensure that foundations are in place today for a carbon neutral tomorrow. And our ambition is no less than to demystify some of the most pressing challenges the industry is faced is related to technology, fuel availability, regulations, infrastructure, and not least an increasing need for cross-industry collaboration. To help you navigate the report's findings, we have invited a stellar lineup of expert voices that will get to talk to you here on stage today. In a minute, I'll happily hand over to the Group President and CEO of DNV, Remy Eriksson. We'll open the show with a keynote. He will be followed by our Maritime CEO, Knud Erberg-Nielsen, who will take you through some highlights of this year's report and obviously also share his personal view on how to best tackle the challenges ahead. Afterwards, we will happily hand over to our top-notch expert, the lead author of this year's Maritime Forecast to 2050 edition. Eric Overham will take you through some of the report's key findings. Afterwards, I will happily hand over to Richard Clayton, very familiar to all of you. I'm sure the chief correspondent of Lloyd's List will get to moderate a panel discussion with some leading industry voices joining us. Some truly big names on the list for that, so a warm welcome to all of you who will join us on the panel later on. Catherine Abson is with us from BP Shipping, Citibank's Michael Parker, the CEO of Hapag-Lloyd, Rolf Haben-Jansen, and Sveinung Øftedal representing the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment. And I'm sure Richard will do a proper round of introduction later on, but a warm welcome on behalf of DNV from my side. All right, that's it from my side for now. Ladies and gentlemen, let's kick off the show. It's a great honor for me to now welcome to the stage the Group President and CEO of DNV. A warm round of applause for Remy Eriksson, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends of DNV, welcome to the launch of this year's edition of the Maritime Forecast to 2050. Armed with the technical insight of the newest vessels, as well as the knowledge and expertise we have on power grids, renewables and oil and gas, I view it as our duty to make available to our customers and wider stakeholders our insights on the energy transition. Looking at this year's Maritime Forecast, I think that Knut and his team have performed the duty with top marks. In May this year, DNV released its first hydrogen forecast to 2050, a subject of strategic importance for the maritime industry because, as you know, hydrogen or hydrogen-derived products such as ammonia, methanol or other synthetic fuels is critical for decarbonization of hard-to-abate sectors like shipping. In mid-October, we will be releasing our 6th edition of our Energy Transition Outlook, which is looking at 10 world regions and the world as a whole. But today, the focus is on the maritime industry and the Maritime Forecast. 5 years ago, when the IMO adopted and launched its strategy for decarbonization, it was met with some skepticism in some corners of the industry. Now I think you will agree with me that this is widely accepted in the industry, and it's also widely expected that when IMO is revising its strategy next year, the ambitions will be heightened. So that the world is on an energy transition journey is beyond dispute. The questions that remain have to do with timing and details. In our Maritime Forecast, you will find a great deal of information on both the timing and the details, and how the complexities around the great fuel switch may play out. No one can predict the future with precision, but the scenarios that our team has put together merit close study. As the transition plays out, our new regulations will be developed, new technologies will be developed. It is of a huge strategic advantage to have mentally prepared for different pathways into the future. And that will increase the chances of making early action. The energy demand shock, the demand shock brought on by COVID, followed by the energy supply shock induced by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, were not forecastable events. Some say that these shocks show how little value energy forecasting brings. Well, I strongly disagree. It is exactly because we have a robust and science-informed forecast model that we can place a dimension on the long-term effects of these shocks. We know, for example, that the pandemic has lowered global economic growth with about 1.5%, and that this will have marginal effect on dampening energy demand. On other long-term effects are dramatic for some industries, like aviation, where business travel is likely to remain 20% down permanently compared to pre-pandemic levels. And the war in Ukraine has obvious and painful short-term effects, no doubt about that. In Europe, it will boost hydrocarbon production in the coming months and most likely the next 2-3 years. But in the medium term towards 2030, it will accelerate investments in renewables as Europe seeks to both decarbonize but also to secure energy interdependence. The net effect for Europe, as we see it, is a slightly faster energy transition through to 2050 for Europe. For other parts of the world, it's a bit different. Owing to supply chain disruptions and tight supply of critical materials, the transition will be slightly slower in other parts of the world, and the net effect being almost neutral towards 2050 compared to when we made our forecast last year. Over a 3-decade perspective to mid-century, the impact of the present war on the energy transition will be greatly outweighed by other factors like carbon price development and also the declining cost of renewables and storage. This will be much more important when we get towards 2030 and beyond. But I must admit, it's difficult not to be distracted by the present energy crisis. Just days ago, Germany announced plans for a 5th floating LNG import terminal, and our industry will be very stretched, helping to supply Europe's gas import needs in the coming months and years. Shortfalls have led to sky-high prices on gas and electricity, and these are very challenging times for many households and for many businesses. And we must remind ourselves that the cost of energy now and in the coming months and maybe year has not raised the cost of the transition itself. And why is that? Well, electrification will play a central role in the transition. The world will more than double electricity in its energy mix during the next 30 years. And with that growth, we are rapidly moving towards a much more efficient energy system. One that will see the world spending a diminishing proportion of GDP on energy, and where energy supply will become more robust and less vulnerable to supply shocks. And the power of energy efficiency to drive not just decarbonization but also lower costs is very important aspects of our maritime forecast. And I'm pleased to see how much attention that subject, which is twinned also with digitalization, and how much this energy efficiency has got attention in our maritime forecast too. What we are currently seeing playing out, the solidarity around security and particularly energy security in Europe, and the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. Well, that gives me encouragement and hope that bold action is indeed possible. It is possible. As citizens and businesses, we also need to step up to see what we can do individually and together for the sake of future generations. And as an industry, for example, Maritime needs to cooperate across industries to build green shipping corridors and play its part in establishing hydrogen-based ecosystems for decarbonization. I can confirm that DNV is committed very passionately to working with those that are willing and able to transition faster. Thank you for your attention.
As the entire world seeks to decarbonize, the maritime industry is owning its part in ensuring our greener future. The search for the best alternative fuel options and technologies has started. 270 billion litres of fuels are needed each year for global shipping transport. In 2030, this will increase to about 320 billion litres. To reach our net zero targets, already 5% of it needs to come from carbon-neutral fuels by then. This makes it clear. The time to act is now. But what fuel to pick? And will it be available? To help the industry navigate a way forward, our 6th Maritime Forecast to 2050 report offers a fresh outlook on regulations, drivers, technologies, and fuel availability. It considers several critical issues underpinning the decarbonisation challenge. What the future fuel mix could look like, ways to find the most efficient and cost-effective ship designs, and the potential impact of regional policy interventions like green corridors. Amid the fog of uncertainty, one thing seems to be clear. Supply chains need to change dramatically in order to scale up the availability of carbon-neutral fuels. Stronger support from decision makers is essential to encourage first movers. These decisions shall not and cannot be taken in isolation. Great challenges demand great teamwork from all corners of shipping's value chain and beyond. And while there are many fuel options still to consider, here at DNV, we believe that collaboration is the real fuel of the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all, and it's really good to be back here at SMM after so long wait. Anna mentioned that I would try to give a little bit of some extracts from the Maritime Forecast report. I will try to do that. I will also top that with some of my own personal interpretations, and I'm sure we will have a very interesting panel discussion following my brief keynote. To build on what Remy said, decarbonization is really one of the major challenges, not only for the maritime industries naturally, but for the entire world. And what we have come to realize over these, say, 6 yearly reports is that the real challenge is not around the shipboard technologies. shipboard technologies will, by and large, be available in the time span of 3 to 8 years, depending on what type of fuel you'll take and what type of segment you're in. The real challenge, ladies and gentlemen, is the availability of carbon neutral fuels, its distribution, and not least its availability in the ports around the world. And that leaves me with one strong conclusion, and that is that maritime industries, shipping industry, cannot resolve this issue alone. We will have to reach out to other industries, to policymakers, to different authorities in different geographies to really get this going. And to produce the carbon neutral fuels has a lot to do with greening of the planet, naturally, but it takes a lot of investments to make that happen. The investments on board will have to be taken by the ship owners. That's a natural consequence. The investments onshore and offshore to produce the green energy is something that cannot be made by the shipping and the maritime community. So in this aspect, I would say that shipping cannot decarbonize alone, and it has to be, it has to be a team effort, and we have to collaborate strongly across industries and with authorities. There are 3 main drivers, you can say. Regulations is one, and this introduction of the CII will be a strong one to drive this forward. But there is also the fact that we have possible taxation schemes, whether it's the EU scheme or international schemes. And the third driver is really around the scope 3 emissions that so many of the charterers, the big mining companies and others will have to live up to. So all of this, ladies and gentlemen, it really creates a significant challenge. And one way to resolve this beyond just reaching out is really working with what was launched at COP26 in November last year, introduced as the so-called green shipping corridors. A lot of nations signed to the Clydebank Declaration, which is a very good step, but still there is too much talk and too little action. And I'm very encouraged by the Nordic ministers who have actually taken the step to put a public-private partnership in place, engaging with the industries to set up green corridors between the Nordic countries. And I know that there are ports like Singapore, Rotterdam, and others that are looking into similar initiatives. And that is really important because creating these mini ecosystems with all stakeholders involved create also a level playing field. It is not possible for someone who wants to buy the more expensive carbon neutral fuel to compete on the same terms as someone who buys the traditional fuels. So ladies and gentlemen, there are many things that I could sort of highlight, but I think I tried to highlight some of the key findings, the key takeaways, and I would encourage all of you to study the report in more detail. It has naturally a lot more depth, and I'm very much looking forward to Eirik's presentation of the report, and this has been 12 months in the making, and all of you here today will be the first to have this actually presented to you. And on behalf of DNV, on behalf of Remy and myself, I'm really pleased that you took the time, and I'm pretty sure that the stuff that we will now present, based on 12 months of research, will be truly interesting and create for a very interesting discussion, Richard, later on. So with that, may I introduce Eirik, our chief editor and author, to the stage and give you a presentation, please. Thank you.
The Maritime Forecast to 2050 is one out of DNV's suite of energy transition outlook reports. This is the 6th edition, and it gives an updated outlook on drivers, regulations, future technologies, and the costs of decarbonizing shipping. The premise of our forecast is that the ship world fleet must decarbonize. And while the pace of this transition is not yet decided upon, the direction is clear. And the intention with this year's report is to gain an increased understanding of how the underlying mechanisms will determine the future fuel mix of shipping, with a focus on fuel availability and infrastructure. In this year's report, we explore the future fuel mix and implications for decisions made today. To do this, we will show the impact drivers, technologies, and fuel availability have on the uptake of different carbon-neutral fuels. Drivers and regulations will compel ship owners to apply new fuels and technologies to reduce emissions, while the successful development of cost-effective and safe technologies will determine what can be installed on future ships. While the crucial aspect of production of carbon-neutral fuels will determine if a given fuel is available, as well as its final cost. Considering these uncertainties, we have developed and provide a set of fuel uptake scenarios. Now, these scenarios do not give a perfect and certain picture of the future. They can be used in decision-making processes to achieve more robust and future-proof solutions. And we have further updated our carbon risk framework to include the latest modeling, and we provide an enhanced tool with the aim of assisting ship owners in their design of future-proofed vessels. On the topic of drivers and regulations, we see that emerging frameworks and standards will enable regulators, cargo owners, and investors to drive decarbonization. 2022 is a working year, developing and supporting frameworks. Next year it starts with the carbon intensity indicator rating and the energy efficiency design index for existing ships. We expect them to have a significant impact on ship design and operation, and by 2030, 5% of fuel will have to be carbon neutral. If we are to achieve a 40% reduction of carbon intensity of shipping from 2008 levels. The IMO has already agreed that the ambitions need strengthening, but not by how much. Concrete proposals have been submitted, arguing for full decarbonization by 2050. Negotiations have begun, and the decision is expected in 2023. There are emerging regulations like the Fuel EU Maritime and the GHG fuel standard in the IMO. And the net zero targets by cargo owners will set requirements on the well-to-wake emissions of the fuels used by ships. And if cargo owners are to achieve their ambitions, they will need to purchase low and zero carbon shipping. Access to capital depends increasingly on environmental credentials and following the decarbonization trajectories throughout the lifetime of ships. And financial institutions are required to report on their portfolio's compliance with sustainable investment taxonomies. The fuel transition in shipping has started and is accelerating. The number of ships in the order book that can operate on alternative fuels has tripled from 2019 to 2022. And by gross tonnage, 30% of the order book is able to use LNG as fuel. In order to tackle the decarbonization, onboard technology is being developed, and key fuel technologies will be available in 3 to 8 years. This figure shows estimated maturation timelines for onboard technologies, with methanol being the most developed technology, ammonia is next in line, hydrogen focusing on the short sea segment, and onboard CCS is coming as well, as all solutions are explored since shipping needs to switch to carbon-neutral energy supply chains, where the sustainable energy should be directed to where it has the biggest greenhouse gas reduction potential. Now, carbon-neutral fuels, they can be divided into 3 families: biofuels, electrofuels, and blue fuels. If sufficient biomass, sustainable biomass becomes available, biofuels will be preferred, as their biomass is easily converted into relatively energy-dense hydrocarbon fuels, such as bio-MGO, bio-LNG, or biomethanol. The electricity for producing electrofuels should be renewable, but one must also consider alternative uses of that renewable electricity due to the low efficiency of electrofuel production. For carbon-based electrofuels, such as electrodiesel, to have a large share of the future carbon-neutral fuel mix, there will have to be a high availability of low-cost, sustainable carbon. Similarly, there will have to be a large-scale build-out of carbon capture infrastructure and carbon storage to provide large amounts of blue fuels, or to allow for a large-scale use of onboard CCS. Because no industry can decarbonize in isolation, global industries need to make the right choices together. For example, to maximize the greenhouse gas reduction potential of sustainable biomass, it should be reserved for hard-to-abate sectors like shipping and aviation, rather than being used for electricity production. To make sense of all this, DNV developed the GHG pathway model that enables understanding of the complex landscape. So we have built a model to simulate the future fuel mix of the world fleet, and it requires significant amounts of input data. The model simulates the world fleet. It simulates every ship by itself. It goes year by year. It builds ships and scraps ships to meet transport demand. It chooses technology for new builds and retrofits. And it chooses the lowest cost fuel combination each year that meets the regulatory requirements imposed on the world fleet. Now, this tool does not give a perfect and certain picture of the future, but as I said, it can be used in decision-making processes to achieve more robust and future-proof solutions. Next, we present some results from our modeling, simulating 2 different regulatory pathways, and we see that energy efficiency is important, but carbon-neutral fuels are needed to decarbonize the world fleet. These examples of model output show the total world fleet emissions and the effect of trade growth, logistics improvements, energy efficiency measures, speed reduction, and carbon-neutral fuels. It is worth noting that digitalization can be an enabler for decarbonization and monitoring of the performance of ships. And digital technologies are essential for taking out the full potential of energy efficiency measures and improved operations, which both are low-hanging fruits with low investment compared to alternative fuels and conversion. Still, by 2030, 5% of fuels will have to be carbon neutral in order to decrease the carbon intensity of shipping by 40% from 2008 levels. The overall picture from all of this is that fossil fuel use in shipping will decrease or be eliminated, as shown in these figures where the uptake over time for each fuel type is seen. In our model, the use of fossil fuel oil will decrease towards 2050 seen here with the maximum and minimum shares in the 12 IMO ambition scenarios seen in dark blue. For the decarbonization by 2050 scenarios, seen in light blue, the use of fossil fuels is eliminated by 2050. For fossil LNG, we see a clear increase in most scenarios. For scenarios with higher LNG price, we see a shift towards MGO and ammonia. The fossil fuels will be replaced by carbon-neutral fuels, and carbon-neutral LNG and carbon-neutral LNG and MGO will largely replace fossil versions. Carbon-neutral fuels that can be bio, electro, or blue versions, and their share of the future fuel mix rely on underlying assumptions further described in our report. All these fuels must balance investment and fuel cost, also considering additional space needed for energy storage, which can mean reduced range or lost cargo space. And this means that carbon-neutral energy, carbon-neutral MGO, even though often having higher prices than the other carbon-neutral fuels in our scenario, has an advantage due to well-known technology, high energy density, and use as drop-in fuels. LNG-capable ships can blend in or use entirely carbon-neutral electro-LNG or bio-LNG, some of which is present in all scenarios. The future shares of new fuels is also modeled, and we see that ammonia and methanol need to have significantly lower costs than carbon-neutral MGO to compete. We also see that the modeled shares of ammonia and methanol vary more than the shares of other carbon-neutral fuels. In scenarios representing futures, where the amounts of sustainable biofuels and sustainable carbon are not high enough, ammonia is the preferred fuel. These different fuels have different ways of being produced and of being used, with different implications on investment on land and on board. But overall, we see that the transition entails large onboard investment, but even greater onshore investments. For each scenario, we show the capex needed to 2050 onshore and the capex needed for new technologies on board. Decarbonizing shipping completely by 2050 will require about 2.5 times as much investment as if we follow the current IMO ambitions. We also see that the scenarios with the high availability of renewable electricity, which means they are using electric fuels, have significantly higher investment than the other scenarios. And fuel infrastructure investment will outpace onboard investment in almost all scenarios. In summary, the fuel transition in shipping is accelerating, and key fuel technologies will be available in 3 to 8 years. However, the fuel transition at sea hinges on development on land, and fuel availability becomes a key challenge. In addition, the transition will require large onboard investment, but even greater onshore investments. And our 24 scenarios shows that the future fuel mix is highly dependent on fuel price and policy ambition. And this means that ship owners need transition plans reflecting the uncertain future and fuel-flexible solutions that provide robustness and reduce carbon risks. The implications of this is that the development of sustainable fuel supply chains must be accelerated to achieve the transition. 5% carbon-neutral fuels are needed by 2030. It's required to have clear criteria for and increased production of sustainable biomass, renewable electricity, sustainable carbon, and carbon storage. The transition entails large onboard investments, but even greater onshore investments. We onboard investments, annual investments are needed about $8 to $28 billion. Onshore, we are needing about $30 to $90 billion annually to decarbonize shipping. Fuel flexibility and fuel-ready solutions, combined with improved energy efficiency, provide business robustness and reduce carbon risk. This requires collaboration across industries and authorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Ira. Great job done to squeeze all the insights and all the research that are collated, I believe, in an 80-page document into a 10-minute presentation. Thank you so much. There's so much, of course, in the report. So as Keynote also mentioned earlier, we encourage you to take a deep dive yourself. And the report is available for download as of today at dnv.com/maritime forecast. And those in the room actually have a small QR code for you to take home and scan. Highly recommended. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to what I personally consider the highlight of today's event. Let's ask some of the leading industry voices representing all parts of the value chain in shipping to see what their take is on the challenges ahead and what it takes to take the right decisions together. We will now hear it from ship owner. We have cargo owners, regulators, banks all represented. So very much looking forward to that. So if I could kindly now ask the panelists to join us here on stage. Knut, if you would join us as well, please. And Richard, maybe I can steer you away. So while everybody else is settling in, I get the time to ask you two questions. And I know you're journalists and you prefer asking questions than getting questions.
Indeed.
Yeah, I saw that coming. Nonetheless. So well, how does it feel to be back at SMM?
Oh, it's really good. I've missed it. I've had a walk this morning between Hall A4 and Hall B4, and I've met old friends and made some new friends, and that's what SMM can do for you. It creates contacts in moments.
Indeed, so fantastic to have you here. And maybe on the topic of decarbonization, one question from my side. Would you agree that there is a certain momentum in the maritime industry? And to quote a famous German band, the Scorpions, do you feel there is a wind of change?
Do you know, listening to Eric, it made me think about the work that began on the first of these maritime forecasts, which was probably 2015. In those days, 2050 was a generation away. We don't have to worry about it quite so much. We're now thinking about 2023, and 2050 is not that far away. And if anything has changed, it's that the time has altered within our minds. It's no longer out there, it's now we have to act.
Now we have to act, and we also have to talk. So I'll leave you to host the panel discussion. Thank you for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Huge amount of effort has gone into the Maritime Forecast to 2050, as I'm sure you will read yourself. As a journalist, I tend not to go straight to the executive summary or the forward from the DNV Maritime President Knud Orbeck-Nielsen. I tend to go to the back page and have a look at who actually contributed to this report. So the lead authors and the contributing authors and the reviewers and the designers and the layout team. It's been a job of work for an awful lot of people. This is a really complex subject. And I applaud you for getting what is so complex into 80 pages that is achievable, readable, understandable. And without the layout, without the photographs, without everything that goes in addition to the text, that would not be possible. So congratulations from a journalist to the layout teams. Now, whatever else shipping is, it's about people. Yes, it's about layout and design, but it's also about fuel specialists. It's about the logistics teams. It's about everybody you can think of, all the parts of our business that are related here. It's about people. People ask questions because they need to know answers, and people need answers because they have to make significant decisions. So I'm going to be asking some questions of my panel now. We've got half an hour to tackle 6 of the most difficult questions that I could come up with. So if we don't find the solutions, at least I hope we've unpackaged the problem. So my panel today is Knud Aabæk Nielsen, President of DNV Maritime, Sveinung Oftedal from the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment, Rolf Haben-Jansen, Chief Executive of Hapag-Lloyd and Co-Chairman of the World Shipping Council, Catherine Upson, Vice President for Partnership and Strategic Implementation at BP Shipping, and Michael Parker, Chairman, Global Shipping Logistics and Offshore at Citi, and of course, Chairman of Poseidon Principles. A warm welcome to all of you. So the first question is this one. In 2023, there will be several environmentally focused and international regulatory instruments taking effect, not least, of course, IMO's revised greenhouse gas strategy. So is shipping's decarbonisation now at a tipping point, or will it take more than just regulatory certainty? Sveinung, the obvious first question to you, are we at a tipping point?
Well, I would say yes, but first let's just confirm that further regulations will be needed in order to frame the decarbonisation of shipping. Otherwise, it will not happen. But it is not regulations who creates decarbonisation. It is the industry who creates decarbonisation. And therefore, I think the Maritime Forecast is very good in pointing towards those elements. So what needs to happen is, of course, to invest in the human capital that the smartest minds need to concentrate on decarbonisation and needs to give the opportunity to do their technology testing of the new solution, which you can see here at SMM in the exhibition hall. And of course, further, you need to have access to the finance, and also you need to have the access to the energy. So further regulations will be needed, but industry need, of course, to create it, the decarbonisation itself.
Thank you for saying about the people. That's something I write about a lot. Knut, take us on from there. More than regulatory certainty, isn't it?
Yeah, I think now there's also about transparency. I mean, I talked about the Scope 3 emissions, which is a very strong driver, especially for those that are carrying other people's cargo. And transparency in general is really being more in focus these days. And we have the CII regulations that we talked about, and those will also encourage the performance improvements and also transparency around performance. And then there's the ESG revolution that's hitting everyone in all industries. So I think these are all very important drivers. And whether we are at a tipping point or not, I think still there is a lot of talk and could be more action. But what I see is that there is a lot of investments these days in vessels with alternative fuel solutions, which I think is a really good start. Because after all, we need to have vessels in the water that are testing out some of these, say, alternative fuel solutions.
Thank you. New fuels have the potential to bring global shipping to zero, but it won't be done for decades, or certainly for several years, according to the findings of this report. So what technologies should ship owners be investing in, and why? Catherine, you're a technology expert. What technology should we be focusing on?
So I think it's going to be a very individual decision for every owner, depending on the fleet they have, the segment they operate in, the age of their fleet, and so forth. And as we've heard, there's no one technological solution that's going to work for all of us. So as BP Shipping, we've been investing in 2 main areas that might be interesting for people to hear about. The first one is in biofuels. And the reason we're interested in biofuels is because obviously we can lower our CO2 emissions immediately with biofuels being a drop-in fuel. And in 2020, we carried out really comprehensive biofuels trials on one of our vessels, the British Captain, trialling a B30 and B50 blend using sustainable biofuels blended with VLSFO. And we measured the emissions, we trialed at different engine loads, really to understand the performance of those fuels, to give us comfort to be able to run them again after this initial trial. And the results of the trials were exactly, fortunately, as we'd expected. Our CO2 emissions were reduced and the vessel performance was unhindered. And since then, we've been running biofuels and trialling them on some of our time charter vessels. And then this year, we trialled some biofuels on the British Sailor loaded out of Singapore, the first time that we'd done that from Singapore. So I think, again, as Eirik was saying, sustainable biofuels are not the final solution, but they're definitely in the mix at this point in time. And then, if I may, the other area that we've been focusing on is improving our vessel efficiency. And so this is looking at things like underwater cameras to monitor the hull conditions, advanced paint coatings for the hull with better anti-fouling properties, and also looking at anti-fouling devices in hard-to-access areas of the hull. And again, as was highlighted earlier, underpinning all of this is digital transformation as well. So we want to be able to monitor our vessels in real time, whether they're our operated vessels or our time-chartered vessels. But that way, we can really manage them in real time and get the most efficient journeys, whether they're laden or in ballast, but we're monitoring them all the time.
Are you able to look at individual vessels and pinpoint certain technologies, or are you doing much more of a kind of clean sweep?
So it can be very individual. So with the digital platforms that we've got, we're monitoring every vessel. But equally, some of the technologies will apply across, say, all of our product tankers.
Rolf, how are you looking at the same problem from the container shipping sector?
Well, not so different, actually, as Catherine described. I mean, also we do quite a lot of biofuel. I think this year we hope to burn about 100,000 tons of that. And that indeed gives immediately a contribution, so that's good. In addition to that, we also invest in the type of technologies that you just described for pretty much every vessel, for which we committed, I think, in total, well, probably in the end, it's going to be about $300 million. And then when you look at future propulsion, I mean, we have invested in LNG-ready ships, or basically dual fuel ships. Yeah. The first ones will be delivered next year. Of course, one can debate today about, was LNG a good choice, but I think that kind of illustrates very much where the market is. Nobody really knows. Yeah. And I think in the end, there's not going to be one solution that fits all, and I believe that what we will do is we'll continue to look at that, and probably we'll also look at ammonia, we'll probably also look at methanol, and maybe for short sea at some point in time also hydrogen, and I think some other things may also pop up, and I thought it was quite interesting that you mentioned also the whole point about carbon capture, because I personally think that that's probably going to play a bigger role going forward than many people thought just 1 or 2 years ago, when there was very little talk about that, as everybody starts to realize that, the availability of carbon neutral fuels is going to be a big problem, yeah? Despite all the talk about that, and despite all the projects that you get bombarded with in your inbox about every day, yeah? About people that are going to do things by 23 and 24 and 25, and then 3 months later, they typically tell you that 23 should read 25 and 25 should read 28. I think that's why we, need to be a little bit realistic. In the end, it's going to be a combination of everything. And the last thing I'd mention, which ties into Catherine's point also on how you steer the ships, in the end, it is also very much going to be about just consuming less energy. I mean, and I know that that's not very popular, because people would say, that's something we've already done. But I'm very much convinced that there's still a lot of mileage on that topic as well, especially as we now come out of the pandemic. That certainly hasn't helped efficiency, to be honest. Yeah, and hopefully that'll also contribute us to all just consuming a lot less fuel. And let's not forget that, particularly in container shipping, if you replace big ships, if you replace small ships by big ships, then in the end you also save a lot of fuel. And I know a lot of people don't like big ships, but if you look at how much fuel they burn and how much emissions they have per container being transported, the difference with, for instance, a traditional Panamax is just huge.
Michael, from the finance point of view, are there any technologies that particularly excite you?
I think, as Rolf said, all of them have to be available, because some of this, a lot of the work is going on clearly in the energy sector. And what's important for the shipping industry is not to yet again be the sludge at the bottom of the barrel. And that word that Keynote used, collaboration is the fuel of the future, or was in the video, I think is absolutely crucial, that the shipping industry is actually part of those discussions. And that means all technologies have to be tested and have to be financed. And I think one of the key things around the lead up to COP26 was there were no rules set by GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, this so-called 130 trillion, which is to decarbonise the global economy, not just shipping. And the key thing is people want to invest in all the alternative technologies, and that I think is what we will see. I think there is a tendency in life generally to try and simplify and say there's only one solution. There are multiple solutions, and this, of course, is the issue, as I talked to Keynote earlier, about pragmatism versus idealism. The only way this is going to work is if people are encouraged to invest in all the alternatives, and then the market ultimately will make the decision. But there's a lot of new technology that has to be invested in, and this is the thing that I will get to say, I think, in a few minutes maybe. This is a revolution. This industry is changing dramatically. It's through evolution because it's going to take time, but this is fundamental change that's going to dramatically change the way the global trade system works, the way supply chains work. And part of that is because this industry is lucky to have a global regulator, slow though they may be, and can measure emissions. The currency of this industry and of global trade is emissions, just as collaboration is the fuel.
Thank you very much. Shipping's struggle to secure a united international response to the recent crew change crisis could arguably reveal a lack of influence with decision makers outside our industry. So how, this is the critical question, as Keynote was saying earlier, how can shipping ensure that we have sufficient influence beyond our borders to secure the quantities of carbon neutral fuels that we'll need to meet decarbonisation? Keynote, how do we ensure that?
Thanks for posing that question to me. Well, I think that, beyond the collaboration topic, but I think in many cases, politicians are by nature concerned with their own constituencies, their own nations, their own geographies. And for a global industry, it is sometimes hard to sort of make them prioritize the global needs beyond and above what they have in their own local communities. And I think that is really a key challenge. But when we try to resolve climate change, which is a truly global challenge, it cannot be resolved locally. So in order to make that come through, I think shipping really needs to reach out in all, the different geographies and with the different authorities. And there are voices that say shipping should have one voice. I'm not so sure. I think it's really important that shipping really penetrates all these different policymakers, also at the local levels, to see the importance and how shipping can contribute to reducing emissions overall. And you highlight the problem during COVID. It was really difficult to make seafarers recognized as key workers. It took a lot of effort.
We've talked about this topic at the Global Maritime Forum over many years. How do we raise the profile of the industry? Do you think we're any further down the line now than, let's say, 10 years ago?
I think so, but there's still a lot to be done. But I think, turning to practical examples, I think the video made by BIMCO was a very good one. It was released, if I remember correctly, last year, and it sort of brought a lot of the values that shipping creates and the necessities of the global supply chains visible to the general public. And after all, that is really important. Those are the voters that will put the right politicians in place.
Michael, can you take that on? How do we ensure there are enough fuels for us to achieve our goals?
Well, I read the report from the front, unlike you, and the sentence that struck me about page 20, three key fundamentals of driving shipping decarbonisation: regulations, cargo owner expectations, and access to capital. No mention of ship owners. But the reality is the ship owner, of course, is the most important, but only because the cargo owner is going to choose what ships to use, what to put their cargo on. And finance is going to choose what to finance by virtue of emissions, Scope 3 being the key one, clearly. And I think that's what's going to drive it, that actually cargo is going to say, I only will move, and we've seen this with the COSEV Alliance announced last year, And they changed certain companies' expectations of being neutral, Maersk being the obvious one to begin with, to 2040 from 2050. So the big shift to me, and it's connected with what Keynote just said, is the world woke up, partly with the Ever Given stuck in the Suez Canal, that actually shipping is how everything gets delivered. You may see a white van in the street at the end of the process, but actually it's the shipping industry that keeps global trade moving. And I think it's those demand signals which the energy industry has often said, where are the demand signals? They're coming, and they're going to come from cargo. So it'll be the cargo owners who will say to Rolf and will say to people in other sectors, I want you to use these fuels. Now, what finance will need to finance the new technologies and those ships is the certainty of cash flow. We're not going to do decarbonization speculatively like people love to do in shipping. This is going to be long-term, it's going to be investable, needs to be safe technically, it needs to be reasonably safe financially, there has to be some risk clearly. And that comes from what's moved on the ships, not the ship. And that's the fundamental change taking place in the ship industry, which many ship owners don't like. It's no longer about the ship, it's actually about the cargo and the emissions created by the cargo when it's moved.
Wow. Sveinung.
Well, if I may continue, I think the time we had when we had unlimited availability of residual fuels, unlimited availability of human capital, unlimited availability of everything is over. And I think decarbonization is putting a focus on that. Now there will be more competition on the various resources. I think you can see it in global trade already today. There is competition. There will be competition on energy, on finance, on everything, on the best minds. And I think decarbonization now is the shipping industry. It has now placed itself in a position where you are in a place where you can win that competition. And I think the success of decarbonization in shipping is reliable on that factor.
Thank you. I want to move on a little bit to your role as leaders within the business community. On many occasions, I've heard shipping leaders bemoan the disconnect between what's decided at boardroom level and what actually happens at the coalface, if I can use that fossil analogy. So what measures have you taken to ensure that your organization is fully engaged and mobilized to the vision that you have for green shipping? Rolf?
I mean, I think that's that question is not so different from any change you try to create in an organization. In the end, I think in most cases it's about being clear what you want to achieve and why, make sure the incentives are aligned, and that you communicate about it properly and that you engage in a good dialogue with people. Of course, when you take certain decisions and then they get cascaded through 3, 4, 5 layers, then in the end what ends up much lower down can easily become be perceived as something very different than what it was intended for. And I personally don't see that huge disconnect, to be honest. I think when we discuss about what do we need to do in order to decarbonize quicker, I certainly think that the discussion today is different than it was 5 years ago or 7 years ago, when a lot of people thought, yes, that's nice to have, and at some point in time we'll do it. I think that has changed, also because we continue to get in quite a lot of young people, that also push the organization and their peers in order to become a little bit different. So yes, it is an issue, not bigger than in any other change program, and I think in the end it is about communicating what you want, go into a dialogue, set clear objectives, and make sure that the incentives to people are aligned with what you want to do. Will that solve everything? No, of course not, but that's a normal change process.
It's interesting what you say about bringing in younger people, because younger people have different views, don't they? So have you changed the caliber, not the caliber, but the talents that you're looking for going forward?
If that's the question to me, yes, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that that it's sometimes also not so easy to convince young people to join shipping, because they would say, it's a dirty industry. I would turn it around. If you want to make an impact in changing something in the world, then you join shipping, because we're not yet that good, maybe in many aspects. So there you can really make an impact, and I think that in many cases that works. But I do think that there is still some work to be done on making the image of shipping better, because when you just look at the facts, then shipping remains actually, one of the most environmentally friendly modes of transport if you compare it to many others. And I think we tend to forget that.
Catherine, take that on, because we were discussing this earlier, that in order to attract people, you change the company, or at least the direction of travel of your company.
Yeah. And that's certainly been the case for us, because again, I similarly don't feel there is a big disconnect for us. And certainly the teams we've got, I feel, actually are very engaged in decarbonisation, and they want to transform, they want to progress, whether it's internally for us with our own business, our own fleet, or whether it's wider participation in industry consortia or JIPs. And I think it's increasingly part of the way that we work and we're expecting people to work. And I think it's also about having the systems in place that really encourage people to be able to make the decisions themselves, to be able to progress them and see them through to delivery. And in fact, since 2020 in BP, we've got an internal fund now that people can apply for if they have a decarbonisation idea, where they can get the funding and they have the ability to take whichever idea it is through to implementation. And if I think about the trial that I mentioned earlier on the British sailor, on the biofuels, that wasn't a board directive to do it. That was the commercial and technical teams working together, making the business case, and getting the funding to be able to do that. And we could really clearly see the benefits of doing that, and we got the approval to do it, but it wasn't something that was told we needed to go out and do. And I think that way people are much more engaged and they feel empowered and they want to be a part of this. And so for us, it's very much about creating the right culture, finding the right people. The people absolutely are critical, but then giving them the freedom to go off and be able to really be engaged and have that incentive themselves to be able to deliver on these decarbonisation projects.
Knut, do you have a suggestions box where people can lodge, this is what I think we should be doing?
No, we don't have a suggestion box as such, but we are encouraging, like Catherine says, to really have ideas and come up with ideas. And one very concrete example that has really been driving the organization forward is that we each summer engage about 12 summer students to work on specific projects, and with very limited boundaries to what they look into, but say on the topic of decarbonization. And the ideas that they come up with, and with the support of our, say, a more experienced staff, is really very interesting. And some of these projects, they actually materialize in one shape or the other in some years thereafter. So this is, I think this is what we are all driving at, is the maritime renaissance, to let that sort of spirit of innovation and ideas come forward. And as Rob said, young people want to have a significant contribution and they like big challenges. And I think that calls for them, as Rob said, to work in the shipping industry. We have big challenges.
And we're sitting in front of your slogan here about turning uncertainty into confidence, and sometimes that can be done by people who are not within our industry or who you'd think are still at a very junior level, because they think completely different from the senior directors.
True. Challenge the status quo.
Now, several large operators, and we know who they are, low-risk borrowing profiles, they're backed by willing lenders, are able to make great strides towards decarbonisation. How do we bring smaller operators with older tonnage along with us? And bearing in mind, most of our industry is smaller operators, maybe family, maybe 5 ships. How do we bring those guys along with us? Michael?
I hate this question because I don't agree with the premise. At least I'm not in Athens, where my answer would be, I wouldn't get out of the room probably. Life isn't fair. I remember during the financial crisis, when many of the banks based in this city were wrestling with all their problems, a Greek owner, highly respected but relatively small Greek owner, came to me and said, Michael, what do I do? I've paid all my debt on time, I've met all my covenants, and yet no one will give me any money for new ships. And yet all these older vessels, these owners who'd breached their covenants, were being granted relief by their banks and everything else. And it was a very good point he made. I think the answer to the question is there is no God-given right to be a ship owner, whatever size you are. Many small shipping companies were big shipping companies at some point. This is about this transition and this transformation of the industry. And it's about the lowering of emissions before we get to net zero. I think one of the key thing about the initiatives we've done, like the Poseidon Principles for Insurance, the Sea Cargo Charter, these are about taking advantage of the industry's transparency through the data collection system, that IMO regulation, that actually enables us to measure emissions in the supply chain. The size issue is really more one that came out in the report that Eric referred to about the huge amount of capital that has to be invested in this. That inevitably will come from major companies like those represented here. It'll come clearly from governments through whatever levy or other forms of support are agreed. But there are going to be risks in this, and the financial sector is going to look for a return, and I'm afraid it's not going to get a return ultimately from smaller ship owners. Just the economics of investing in capital are not going to work. But having said that, I go back to what I said earlier, it's about the cargo. So it's where the cargo goes, and that's going to be a Scope 3 emission for the bank, for the insurer, and that's what we will be measuring. So and I remember Cargill, when we talked about this a few years ago, about retrofitting, and Cargill talked about being willing to upfront the investment for smaller dry bulk owners if the banks would lend to finance that retrofitting. And I think that is probably the model, that if you can show that through that you will extend the life and you will lower your emissions, money will be made available. But the bigger transition, I think, is going to lead to a lot more consolidation because of the whole scale of the net zero and the new technologies required.
So decarbonisation will lead to a change of the profile of our industry?
Ultimately, yes.
Thank you. Sveinung, how do we move forward?
Well, first I have to say, this transition is not the first transition we see in global trade. If you go decade by decade, I think you can observe many transitions. And I think there are opportunities also for smaller companies. What we see in the domestic and short sea shipping is actually that the front runners are small companies leading to the new solution. However, when it comes to deep sea, I think maybe it is more difficult to survive in this transition. But as I said, there have been, let's say, transitions previously, and I think to the issue of partnering up now, being early in partnering up may be a solution. Now, there will always be operators operating in the lower end of the market. It is happening today, and it will happen in the future. That will be, let's say, in all types of industries, there will be operators in the lower end of the market, and we can't change that. It's how business is.
Rolf, have you any comments on that? How do we keep the smaller players still in the business?
That's a good question. I think in the end, I think, to be honest, I think many of the comments were already made. I think if you are a really innovative player and if you're focused on a certain niche, I think then you can create a certain amount of scale in a smaller market. I think if you look at the deep sea market or at container shipping, I think it's over time going to be fairly difficult for small players to survive if they want to have a truly global footprint, simply because of all the reasons that have already been quoted. Having said that, in pretty much every market, you always find niche players that focus on a certain smaller segment, and they can be successful there, and sometimes can also be very innovative. Yeah. So I think there is room for niche players, but probably more so in some market segments than in others.
Thank you. So we turn to our final question, which is one that I'm particularly exercised by. Recent data from my company, Lloyd's List Intelligence, shows that for 2021, the number of recorded casualty incidents at sea reached the highest for a decade, and that comes after 9 years of steady decline. At the same time, the energy transition is necessitating the adoption of new fuels, as we've heard, and new technologies, which, unless they're properly managed, threaten to destabilize safety at sea. So the question is a very simple one, but a very difficult one. How do we strike a balance between decarbonization and safety? Knut.
Here we go.
It's up to you.
Yeah. I'm not sure if there should be a balance, if you think about it. I mean, it's all about safe decarbonization, isn't it, in the first place? If you cannot do it safely, it shouldn't be done. So I'm not so inclined to sort of make a preference on the scale. I think it has to be done safely. And then, I mean, there are reasons why we are, say, experiencing a worse 2021 than the years before, and a lot of that has to do with the COVID situation, but also a very strong market has certainly helped in, you know, extending surveys and many other things. But I think that the real issue here, if you think a little bit in the longer run, is that if, say, the shipping community waits for the silver bullet before they invest in new vessels that will be better on energy efficiency, as one of the areas that we talked about, we know that older vessels have more incidents, are more exposed to hazards, and are in general exposing more of a safety risk. So that is one area. The other area, which is extremely important, and I think we saw the need for that during COVID, is the education and training and competency of seafarers. I mean, the world we are moving into is a much more complex world than the decade that we put behind us. And if you add on the different fuel options, the different energy efficiency devices, it all adds on to the complexity. And if you think about maybe seafarers on the LNG carriers, you know, one of the sort of most trained and best seafarers, and then you have sort of the general cargo in the other end, you really need to lift the average experience, competence, and not least also the attractiveness of being a seafarer. After all, this is about recruiting seafarers for the next decades, and that needs to be taken seriously.
Thank you. Catherine, in your discussion at BP Shipping, how do you get to a state of safe decarbonisation without saying, oh, we're never going to be there because we can't guarantee 100% safety?
So I think it's going to be a journey really for us to understand which technologies are going to be the ones, say, that we will be using and investing in. But I think it's really going to come down to training for the crews that we have at the moment, but I think also about attracting more people into the industry, because it is a challenge, but it's also very exciting as well. So I think there is something about making sure that we can put the right systems and procedures and training in place, but then making sure that we're bringing in people with different backgrounds and different expertises into the industry. And I think also showing that there's a whole career path to be had as well. It's not necessary that you can be at sea and that is your whole career. There are obviously many jobs within the office side of shipping as well. So I think making it clear to people that there are so many different roles that you can have in this energy transition. Yes, they need to be safe roles at sea, clearly, but we need a lot of people on the shore side supporting this as well.
And part of your role is to encourage diversity of talent within your business. Do you think that helps when we think about safety?
So I think diversity overall is good in every part of the business. And to be honest, I think it's important whether you're looking at it from a safety or a technical perspective or a commercial perspective. I think especially because we're going into uncertainty and we want to have more certainty at the end of it, I think the more people that are involved in those conversations, the more chance we have to be successful.
Rolf, decarbonisation and safety. Does one take precedence over the other?
Well, I mean, I think Knut said it actually quite well. You know, I'm also not so convinced that there's really a balance. I think we would always say safety first. Yeah. That doesn't mean, however, that you should, exclude certain things. And I think when you look also at future propulsion, I think initially there was a lot of anxiety around looking at ammonia at all. Yeah. Because of all the safety concerns, and I think there are definitely some, and we should take them very seriously. But because of that, we shouldn't exclude things. I think one of the challenges you have in this whole debate is that everybody always talks about trade-offs, and you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that, and and sometimes you don't do certain things because you exclude them up front. Yeah, I mean, if you want to have a controversial one, one should not rule out that ships can also sail on nuclear power. Yeah, I know there's a lot of politicians that will say we should never ever do that, and probably today it's not feasible. But I would still encourage that we don't close off too many technological routes that might help us to get to a decarbonized world before we've properly tested them.
One of the things I liked about Eric's study was he tried to look at all of the options.
Yeah.
Without saying this one is never going to happen, but let's have a look at what would happen if we took it forward. Michael, safety and decarbonisation.
I don't want to be facetious, but I'm thinking of the motor car and the man with the red flag who walked in front of it until someone put his foot on the accelerator and ran the man over. I think we've seen with digitalization, we've seen with what's gone on in space, the technological capabilities of society are huge and have to be encouraged through investment. So it's about the mechanisms to get people who have the knowledge to invest in the safety needed. Safety will always come first, there's no question about that, because you're not going to be a cargo owner wanting to put your cargo on an unsafe ship. I do think the issue, though, comes down to cost, and it goes back to the point Rolf made about image. I remember coming into shipping from actually banking in the energy sector, the time where after the supposed worst ever crisis in shipping in the mid-80s, it was all about cost cutting and all the offshore flags were set up, crews were cut back. I think we have to get used to shipping is going to be more expensive than it has been, not because of COVID disruption and supply chain, but just for the operation and the safety and for the career aspects that Catherine talks about. And consumers will pay for that. And I think it's this mental shift to getting safe supply chains working costs consumers money. Will you pay for it? Yes, they will, when they understand what the shipping industry is doing.
And it's that understanding that we're perhaps a little short of at the moment. We've got to keep persuading people. Yeah, I'm going to leave the last word to Norway's Ministry of Climate and Environment, if I may. Can we be sustainable without being safe?
No, of course, safety should never be compromised, and I've been representing Norway at the IMO for over 25 years, so safety should never be compromised, meaning that the decarbonization culture should also within it have a safety culture, and I think we can do that. There are safety concerns also with existing solutions in the energy sector and the shipping sector. There need to be the same safety culture also on the new solution. And we should not forget that also the climate crisis itself has its safety concerns. Today there are floods in Pakistan. I think they are not safe. So the point is moving towards the new solutions in shipping, safety of course need to have the same level and even a better level than we see in shipping today.
Thank you to each of you. Half an hour goes very quickly when you're among friends, and I cannot pretend that we've answered the questions. However, I hope that it's made you think a little differently and to see that we have some real issues to debate and to discuss, and 2050 is only just around the corner. Anna.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Great panel discussion. Thank you to all of you for taking the time today. Just stay seated for another moment. Gives me an opportunity to thank all of you as well in the audience. You've done a fantastic job being a live audience again. That also goes to everybody joining us on the live stream. A few final remarks before I let you dive into the buzz and the hassle of the world's biggest trade show. So, the Maritime Forecast, I mentioned it before, is available for download at dnv.com/maritime Forecast. Highly recommended to do so. Of course, our decarbonization experts, not least Eirik, will be around this week at our booth in Hall B4. So pop by if you have questions how we can help you tackle your own company's decarbonization challenges. And for everybody who cannot make it to Hamburg this week, we have scheduled another webinar on the 22nd of September. We will go a little bit deeper there into the contents of the Maritime Forecast, and you would also get the opportunity to discuss with our experts online. Sadly, this brings our event to a close. It's been fantastic to have you here. A recording will be made available very shortly soon, so in case you would like to replay, that is certainly possible. That's it from my side. I wish you and your families the very best of health, and we look forward to seeing you again very, very soon at another DNV event. Enjoy the SMM. Thank you for today, and goodbye.